Hey everybody, we had a big update from Isaac on the Frosthaven Kickstarter campaign. The official rulebook is now complete. This is pretty much going to be the final rulebook that we're going to see in our printed games. I think there's a few maybe small things that are missing towards the back because of a spoiler territory, but that's kind of understandable. I'm trying to stay away from spoilers myself. So it's really good that we can just see here what the kind of finished rules are going to be, and we can start to really confirm what those differences between Frosthaven and Gloomhaven are going to be. I did previously do a video about known changes that we already knew that were coming to this game that changed some of the kind of fundamental rules. I'll put a link to this video here up in the corner so you can check that out if you'd like. I'm not going to go over every single individual small change in this particular video because, well, you know, I've already done a video about that. But we will go into some new things that I've noticed that I don't think we've spoken about before, and also take a look at some of the kind of general formatting and things like that that this rulebook does. So first off, let's just talk a little bit about the layout changes to the actual manual itself and the way that they've kind of constructed it. I think this is the best version of the Gloomhaven rules we've seen in terms of just the way it's simplicity of the way it's been laid out, the way that it flows from just reading it, also just the presentation style. I mean, if you look at the original Gloomhaven rulebook, it's a lot of just walls of text, paragraphs of text. It can be really hard to kind of get into. I think that might put off some people if it wasn't for the fact that, you know, the game is obviously so good and worth that investment, in my opinion. It's one of those things where maybe a few people might sort of like step away from that. They've actually managed to break all of that kind of information up into nice segments with good visual examples of different things, the rules that they're trying to explain. And they've also put in, you know, nice images of the enemies, of items and things like that, just to visually break it up and make it a little bit easier to digest. It's going to be a bit difficult for me to kind of rank a rulebook in that way because obviously I know the game very, very well at this point in time. So it's very difficult for me to say, well, I think a new player would find this very, very easy, but my impression of it is that it's much more digestible. So I think new players are probably going to have a really good time with this rulebook, and I think this is going to be much easier than at least the previous rulebooks were. And Jaws of the Lion was much better too, so they've obviously been reiterating on this over the years, and they've been getting it right, and as they hone down the rules and get it more and more clear as to what it is really that they need to kind of like put in there. One other thing they've done is they've actually highlighted sections of text in the first part of this book to do with Frosthaven's specific new stuff, which they've highlighted in blue to kind of indicate to seasoned players, if you've played Gloomhaven, that these are just new things that you're going to need to think about, or they're variations potentially to rules that you've already played. I think this is a really good way of just getting you up and running. So if you are really, really experienced with Gloomhaven, you can literally just read these sections and you should be good to go in terms of setting up your first scenario, which I think is really, really nice. If you are coming from Jaws of the Lion, there was some kind of speculation that maybe some more rules from Jaws of the Lion were going to come across, and the line of sight rule has, but most of the other stuff has kind of just been left in Jaws of the Lion. So the book does recommend that you read the entire thing if you are coming specifically from Jaws of the Lion, because, you know, there's a lot of things that don't exist in that game that do exist in Big Gloomhaven and in Frosthaven. So it's just good to get all of those rules under your belt, really. In the rulebook itself as well, there are these spaces for us to put in new rule stickers. Now, this reminds me a lot of the Pandemic Legacy systems. If you've played any of the Pandemic Legacy games, what that game often does is it just gives you spaces in the rulebook for you to put in new rules as your game progresses and things change and you need to set up the scenario differently each time. It's going to be really interesting to see how that works, because Gloomhaven has always felt like the legacy elements were outside of the scenarios, but this is starting to imply that we might have rules that will affect how we set up scenarios, which might mean that there's mechanics coming down the road that can really affect things in a scenario, which will be interesting because the base kind of, you know, load into a scenario, if you like, get all of you guys ready and go sort of stuff has been fixed for quite a while. So this is sneaky quite exciting because I don't really know exactly what this is going to do, but this could be a big change, I think, to actually really mix up just the game-to-game formula, if you like, of how you have to set up your scenario and play the game. So in terms of things that I haven't actually spoken about before and that we didn't really know that are maybe slightly surprises, let's talk about the scenario setup and how the scenario is now going to be presented. There is now a complexity level that's been listed below the name of the scenario, either 1, 2, or 3, to show the kind of length and difficulty or the complexity of the mechanics that are included in that scenario. I think this is like a really nice thing to do so that players who are potentially maybe new might decide to go for a low level of complexity first because maybe they're a bit unsure about the rules, or if, for example, your game group maybe has like an hour or two left on your game session and you're like, well, Do we have time for another one? Maybe we do, maybe we don't. Well, if it's a complexity level 1, perhaps that might mean that you can set it up, play it much quicker, and just get into it. The general layout of the scenario book and how they tell you to set up the scenario has been cleaned up a lot. It looks so much cleaner now. It looks really nice. The monster level and the rank on the boards has also been changed to make it much more legible, in my opinion. I always got really confused with what side of the kind of standee that I was, or the hexagon that was on the board, like what level I was supposed to put in, and I always got confused which one was 2, 3, and 4, and I always had to get the book out every time. Well, now they've just had this little system with the bars. I think that works much nicer, and it looks cleaner too. So that's a really big one in my book that would stop me from forgetting. So I'm happy about that. Also, they've sort of changed a lot of the keys and things like that to show you what the different obstacles are in and what will be included. We have new overlay tiles, and there was a lot of clarification about the rules around overlay tiles in this book in general, which I think is really good. The new tiles that we have is we have icy terrain and we have wall tiles. Icy terrain is basically a bit of ice on the ground, and that when somebody sort of walks onto it or is pushed onto it or goes onto it, then they are forced to slide off the other end, essentially. So it's basically like terrain that's very hard for you to stay on, but also boosts movement. Really interesting. Obviously thematic to Frosthaven, makes a lot of sense for there to be ice. This is going to really make monster movement interesting, because in the AI focus section, it does mention that monsters will use this when determining their focus. So there's going to be some really awkward, weird situations in which monsters are going to be able to reach you where maybe you think that they couldn't, or they might make a decision that you didn't think that they would, because they'd be able to get in somewhere. So that's really interesting. I think that's going to certainly make the scenarios a little bit more kind of dynamic at times if there's this icy terrain, but we don't know how much of this is going to be used. I don't know if this is going to be in every scenario or occasionally here or there. Could be interesting, but again, if you slide from one icy terrain to another one, then you're going to slide off again. So there's a way in theory you could chain this together and kind of slide off towards the end, because you get that one extra movement. So interesting. We'll see how this ends up panning out, but I like this. Thematically a nice change, and another thing for us to think about that could make the scenarios a little bit more dynamic. We also have wall tiles now, so these are little sections that just count as walls. This will give them a lot more flexibility in creating sort of new styles of hex, right? Because if you have the dungeon tiles, they can only be a set size, because that's what the dungeon tile size is. Now if they have wall tiles, they can now start to actually maybe like close little bits off, put things here to maybe slightly change the way that the scenario is laid out, maybe split up 2 rooms and one big hex into 2 small rooms or something like that. It just gives them a lot of flexibility. There's also some rules clarification here that we knew was coming, to do with essentially summons being able to be summoned into hexes containing loot tokens. This was something that we knew was being changed for the rules in this game, but now we get a proper clarification of exactly hexes and how they work. So you either have featureless hexes, which basically contain no tile, or you have unoccupied, which is no figure, and then you have empty, which is neither of those two things. Okay, so tokens do not count as overlay tiles, so that means loot tokens essentially, but also, you know, sometimes players have tokens from their own mechanics that they have. For example, the Deathwalker has a token that they put out onto the board, and essentially this means now that you can summon onto a hex with a loot token in it, because tokens do not count as overlay tiles, which means that a hex that just had a loot token in it would be considered to be empty. Another small change is hazardous terrain has now been broken off from traps in terms of the scaling of the damage of what it does. So it used to be in Gloomhaven that hazardous terrain would do half the damage of traps rounded down, which meant that it was quite high at times and it would scale up fairly quickly. Now what they have done is they've changed this rule to be 1 plus a third of the current scenario level rounded up. So this would mean at level 1 it's going to be 2 damage, and then it's going to scale up. What this means is that you do end up at scenario level 7 getting to that kind of max amount that you would have done in Gloomhaven, but you don't kind of hit that 4 mark quite as quick. So it's a little bit more of a forgiving curve, if you like, for a little bit longer, which I think is nice. It means that players who don't have jump or don't have any way of getting over those kinds of tiles might not be hurt quite as much. But also, on the flip side, means that players can't push enemies into them and deal more damage that way too. So it's kind of like a universal change that maybe makes enemies a little bit harder to deal with, like certain enemies, right? That would be really nice with high shield to just push them into these terrain types. It's maybe not going to do quite as much damage, but also players are going to be able to move more freely. So I support this change. I think this is a good thing to split it off because it didn't really make sense for traps and hazardous terrain to be like linked together. And yeah, it made sense for them to have their own kind of calculation. We do also learn here about the loot deck function and how that is going to be implemented. In Gloomhaven, you used to just pick up a piece of gold from the floor and that would be worth gold equal to the scenario level at the end, cash it all in. There was no other resources apart from gold in terms of looting. Now you're actually going to have lots of different resources that are needed for crafting, and you're going to be creating this loot deck at the beginning of the scenario. The scenario will tell you what cards, what card types to include. You'll randomly take some from those piles, shuffle it all up and make yourself a deck. And then when you take a loot token off the board, you will draw a card and reveal it. If it is anything other than an item, then you're going to cash that out at the end of the scenario. But if it is an item, then you do immediately get to claim that item and you can begin to use it straight away, even if it takes you over the slot amount that you might have on your character. So if it's a small item and you're all full up of small items, doesn't matter. You can continue to use it for that scenario. And I think that's really, really cool. Might lead to some interesting moments where people rush chests because, hey, there might be something cool in there, especially if there is actually a known item in that chest, because you know that that specific chest is an item, and that will certainly mean that players will go for it to maybe be able to use it in that scenario. Might lead them as well to perhaps put some chests earlier on in the scenario and then get you to kind of move on. But if you do manage to get a random item from the loot deck, because it is possible that when you kill an enemy they drop a loot token and you draw one of those cards, sometimes there's going to be items in there. I think there's one item potentially that could be in each one, or I don't know, it's not confirmed yet if it's in every single scenario, but certainly in the example they showed that there's a possibility to draw one item from that deck. That would be really, really interesting to see. Like maybe that would change up the way that you want to play. Might also make looting really, really attractive, and I might have to start reevaluating my my thoughts on loot, because it feels like this is going to be a really very sort of integrated system with both you wanting to improve your character by getting items, but also to be able to craft and contribute to the Frosthaven sort of town development, to be able to start building buildings and also deal with some of the crises and things that are going to come up. So yeah, loot is going to be super, super important and very, very relevant in Frosthaven, much more so than it was in Gloomhaven. It was already important in Gloomhaven for kind of getting good items and enhancements, right? But now we're going to be looking at it having loads of other uses. So it's going to be very, very important for players to loot. So let's talk a little bit about characters. There's a few things here that I noticed that I don't think we've spoken about before. So there are 6 items that are going to be allowed to be carried over from Gloomhaven, if you own it, into Frosthaven as starting items. This was something that I wasn't really expecting. I was expecting Frosthaven to be standalone, possibly with some variants that allow you to do it. Bring in maybe some Gloomhaven stuff or some recommended things maybe that you could use to cross over between the two games. I wasn't expecting it to be baked into the rules here though, and especially if you don't own base Gloomhaven, you're now going to be at a bit of a disadvantage. I mean, it's only just some extra choice of items, but maybe a slight disadvantage, or at least not have as many options as the players who do have Gloomhaven already. It's a nice thing to kind of recognize players that maybe have come from Gloomhaven to say, you know, thanks for buying our previous game. You know, you can use these items in there too. You could also just use a print and play. The files for these items are readily available online, so you can just find them if you wanted to do that. But I just thought it was an interesting choice, and it doesn't say that it's optional. It just says like it says you can do it. I guess it would be optional, but you know what I mean? It doesn't say that it's like a variant rule or not suggested or anything like that, or it is just a black and white, you can do this. So let's go through the items. There are 5 of the 6 of these items are spoiler items technically. So if you are worried about Gloomhaven item spoilers, then jump to the next sort of chapter. I'll put like some chapters down below just to say now we're clear of spoilers. So go to that. But I want to talk about the items because I think it's important. So the first item is Warhammer. This is one of my favorite items from base Gloomhaven. It was a absolute slam dunk starting item for me on the Crag Cart and on the Brute. And I think it's probably going to be a slam dunk starting item on the Banner Spear for me here in Frosthaven. I mean, the amount of AoEs that this character has, that's really going to improve that character, I think. And I'm quite surprised that this was one of the items that we're allowed to bring over, considering that Warhammer is a very, very powerful item. You know, it's not just adding like a little bit of utility, it's adding like a serious tool for players, which I'm a little bit surprised about. But yeah, Warhammer is an amazing item on anybody who can do a large kind of multi-target melee attack or AoE, melee AoE, and the Banner Spear has got a bunch of them and will get more of them as she levels up. So yeah, really like this for the Banner Spear. Next up, we have a Jagged Sword. This is actually just the Wound Sword versus the Poison Sword. So you get the Poison Dagger and you get the Wound Dagger, if you like, Jagged Sword. This is a very nice item for certain characters to pick up. I think like the Blink Blade, for example, might be a good carrier of this. Also might be quite a good carrier would be like the Deathwalker or someone like that. Someone who has a free hand slot who does some melee attacks occasionally. I think that it's a pretty decent item. It's not game breaking or anything. I think Warhammer is kind of game changing, but I don't think Jagged Sword is necessarily game changing, but it's a strong item for sure. Next, you've got Shoes of Happiness. This was a utility item that was never really used in Gloomhaven, and I don't know whether or not it's going to get used here. Maybe we have some more characters who can actually do this amount of movement to capitalize on this. It was always a bit weird in Gloomhaven that you unlock this item quite late in progression, because at that point you probably had like a really nice pair of boots that you were quite attached to and you didn't really feel like using it. But this at least now gives you the option of taking this particular item as a starting item and trying to get that XP out of it. So I don't mind the change. I don't think it breaks anything. I don't think it changes anything. And really, it's just going to be, can we find a good fit with a character? So we'll have to wait and see. Flea Bitten Shawl is another item added. That's a pretty situational item, but not a bad one. It's cheap, it's easy, quite good for melee characters who find themselves in trouble. Also, because of the nerfs now to invisibility in the game, the fact that now that characters can't block doors and things like that, perhaps it's time that we start looking at other sort of chest slot items for these kind of melee glass cannon-y type characters who have a low health pool and need to defend themselves. Maybe Flea Bitten Shawl might be that. So that I think is going to be an interesting option. You've also got Thief's Hood. This was another very situational and pretty much never used item in Gloomhaven that allows you to turn a loot 1 action into a loot 2. I've said previously, looting I think is going to be incredibly important in Frosthaven, so this item could actually become quite usable. If you can pick up lots and lots of loot tokens with 1 action and then just kind of carry on with what it is that you're doing. A lot of players have loot 1 actions, and they've generally made the loot actions a little bit more useful by tying them to another ability as well. Like, not made them so they're not just a loot 1, they do a loot 1 plus something else that might be sort of a little bit of use and a bit of value for your character. So Thief's Hood might actually become quite usable. Whether or not the extra cost to buy an item like this is going to be worth it, though, I don't know. You've also then got Fueled Falchion, another item that, in my opinion, really shouldn't be a single-use item. I really wish it wasn't single-use, but maybe now that they've made it a starting item, maybe it should be single-use, because in Gloomhaven you got it really late and it didn't really, or you got it at a random time and it didn't seem like it fit with anyone in particular. Whereas now, perhaps you could get this fairly early on and use it. And yeah, maybe, I don't know. I've always felt like this item really needed to be like maybe charges or something. I know that there isn't any hand items that are charges that we've seen yet, but perhaps this could have been charges, and then maybe it would have been a bit better. I just felt like as a burn item, it's just a little bit underwhelming, but yeah, another nice tool there. So nothing there from those last ones that really like breaks the game, but Warhammer to me is very powerful. So that is something to maybe consider here, that I don't know whether or not I'm going to be personally playing with it, because I would like to play with all of the new stuff in the game. But if you are bringing it across, I think Warhammer is like the best one by far from those items that they've given us. There's also a new item type called flip items, or a new style of item. So this is one that's actually going to be double-sided. It's going to start on one side, and the first time that you use it, you're then going to flip it over to the other side, and then it's going to do something else, or there's something else that you need to do maybe to flip it back over to the other side. This is just going to be really cool, I think. It's going to add a new sort of mechanic to the game, something fairly simple, probably quite thematic. I can imagine they could do this with stuff that would require ammo, or some sort of like, if you had a crossbow or something, you need to kind of spend an action maybe to reload your crossbow to be able to give yourself pierce again, or something like that. Like some way that maybe that could be used. I think that sounds really interesting. So we'll see. I don't know. They haven't actually shown any items in the book to do with this, probably because they're all spoiler items. So we're going to have to wait and see, but certainly that sounds very interesting and could be quite thematic, I think. They've also changed the rules for resetting item charges on long rests. So in Gloomhaven, let's say you had a piece of armor that had 5 charges and you'd used 2 of those charges. So you had 3 out of 5 left. If you went to long rest, technically you would not be able to get those charges back. You would have to wait until all of those charges are spent. The card is then tapped, and then you would be able to basically refresh that once you go to a long rest, once it's in that tapped state. So now they've changed it so that you can replenish all charges whenever you long rest, regardless of how many charges you have left. This is just a really, really nice change because it's just a bit frustrating and weird. I think a lot of people probably ended up house ruling this, or maybe even playing it like they didn't even know. In fact, I did a video which was to do with like common rule mistakes that you might not know that you're making, and this was one of the rules that I put in there because it just feels a little bit weird. It felt kind of counterintuitive to the game sometimes. So I really like that they've made this change. I think it makes a lot of sense. Now, when drawing battle goals at the start of the scenario, we get to draw 3 instead of 2. Hallelujah. Hopefully no more times of being stuck with 2 really, really obnoxious, hard battle goals that just don't suit your character. Perhaps one that says to kill a completely undamaged enemy in like 1 hit, or to overkill an enemy, or one that says to only earn a certain amount of XP, but everything that your character does is tied to XP, or to use no items when you've just sat there with a whole fully kitted character with all of your items. Those ones I think really should be removed from the game anyway. I just personally find that they are counterintuitive to trying winning. I like the fact that there's a bit of a challenge sometimes, and certainly players can challenge themselves to use them. I'm not a huge fan of battle goals that kind of counter run to what it is that you're trying to do to like achieve success, right? So you need to kind of hinder yourself to achieve success. I like the idea of pushing something, pushing you maybe to try and open a door, or to maybe be the one to loot a chest, or those kinds of ones I don't mind so much, because they are sort of pushing you to kind of do something and kind of giving you a bit of like a push in a certain direction. But like telling you to not use all of the new shiny things that you have, or to not use your cards for XP, which is, you know, a lot of the time the fun of playing the cards, I've always found to be a bit strange. So hopefully they take those out. But if they haven't, just the fact that now we draw 3 should really statistically give you a very good shot of getting at least 1 battle goal that will be achievable for your character type and style of play. One interesting small change here that they've sneaked in, which I wasn't really expecting, or I'm not quite sure why yet exactly, is we are not able to remove round bonuses from our active area, but we can remove persistent bonuses from our active area. This is a bit strange, so I'm thinking cards like Enhancement Field for the Tinkerer, which gives everybody +1 attack. Sometimes what you might want to do in a situation like this is you might want to play Enhancement Field, play your top attack to get that +1 attack, but then actually you want to discard Enhancement Field from your active area to then recover it with a stamina potion, for example. I do this more on some unlockable characters, and I'm going to keep this spoiler free for that, but there are some unlockable characters that can really use this way of doing things to keep their damage kind of ticking along. And I'm surprised to see that we're not allowed to do that. Feels a little bit odd. I'm not quite sure as to why. Maybe there's certain characters that if we could do that, it would break them. I don't know. But it just seems like an odd thing to just add a little caveat here, because that was not the case before, or at least it was not the case in the games that I've played. So I don't really understand why that's there, but there must be a reason for it, because it is listed as like highlighted as a proper change. There is now also a in-depth section on manipulating overlay tiles specifically. I can see potentially these rules playing a big part maybe in scenario rules. So maybe a scenario asks you to move one obstacle from one place to the other. They've also added a new keyword, which is spring, which is to do with traps, to be able to basically spring a trap on your turn. I think only the Scoundrel maybe used the word spring in Gloomhaven. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but that was my feeling. They've just basically really kind of elaborated on these rules. These are rules that they didn't really kind of specify particularly, or they didn't maybe need to in Gloomhaven. So obviously they're going to be a bigger part of Frosthaven. Okay, so that kind of wraps up the rules that are new, or at least that jumped out at me. There are more. Obviously, there's lots of changes here, but as I said, I've done a video about that already, so I'm not going to go on that. The other section of the rulebook, though, is all about the campaign and about how you actually run your campaign. Now, every single player is going to need to read this, because this is all unique to Frosthaven. This is all new stuff. And I don't really want to go into loads of detail about this, because this could be its entire video just on its own, really, about the campaign. All I'm going to say is that I got really excited about the game reading this section. It sounds really cool, and I really encourage everybody to go and read this if you are planning on playing the game. This has got to be one of the most expansive systems we've seen in a board game ever. I mean, it sounds like a video game. Like, it sounds like a video game, the way that all of this stuff is linking together, and it's got me really, really, really excited for this game. So I'm not going to go into too much detail. Maybe I'll do a future video where after people have had a chance to read it, maybe we can go through the guts of it and we can really get stuck in. But wow, it is really good. And I'll put a link down below to the rulebook. So if you want to go and check it out for yourself, please do. I think it's a really good read. Okay, so I don't know about you, but this particular update has gotten me really pumped again for Frosthaven. It's been a while since we've had like a really substantial bit of news for us to be able to hang our hat on and really kind of get stuck into. And this has been great. It's a really, really great rulebook. I love it. I think it's great. So again, respect to Isaac and to Jason, who work specifically on the rulebook. It's a really, really tight rulebook. I really enjoyed reading it, and I think they've done an amazing job of really distilling everything down and not making it too kind of much for new players. So yeah, really hats off. It's a really great job. If you did enjoy the video and want to get more Frosthaven news and content as it comes out, please do consider subscribing to the channel. It helps me out so much on YouTube, and like the video if you did enjoy it. You can also come over to twitch.tv/mandatoryquest every Monday, Wednesday, and Sunday, where I stream on Twitch, pretty much always playing Gloomhaven, occasionally some other games here or there, but mostly Gloomhaven. So come hang out if you like, and yeah, maybe we can have a chat about this update, and let me know what it is that you're really excited about and what in this particular rulebook you really liked, or perhaps maybe you didn't like. But I personally feel like this is an absolute slam dunk, so we'll see. And yeah, the excitement for Frosthaven is back up to the surface again, and I think yeah, I just can't wait to get hold of this game. Okay, all that's left for me to say again is thank you all so much for watching. I will catch you in the next video. Bye.
I think so. Yeah.
Oh,
Scout
that's the blessing from Cameron.
Yeah.
That's the blessing
So,
from.
Isaac, at this point, can we get your approval to add an additional attack modifier deck for allies in the digital version?